Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Quaranta, President of the Delaware State Chamber. Thank you for joining us again as we approach Election Day, November 2022. And we're really excited to have Ashlee Rich Stephenson from the United States Chamber of Commerce join us again. Elections really matter. And regardless of your political views or candidates of choice or party of choice, it's really important for business people, be they employers and employees, to have a sense of what the electorate is saying and where we might be headed and what the balance of power will look like in our nation's capital and perhaps in some of the states and some key races around the country, whether it is for governor or U.S. Senate, House of Representatives, and things like that. We're really grateful that Ashlee's here. Without further ado, let me kick this over to Rebecca Bird. Rebecca is with the firm of Bird Gomes. She's been a longtime friend of the chamber. Her father, Bob Bird, Kim Gomes, Rebecca, others have one of the longest serving lobby firms in Dover. And we're grateful that Rebecca will offer a couple comments to introduce Ashlee, and then we'll get on with our program. So Rebecca.
Thanks, Mike. So yes, as Mike said, I'm from Bird Gomes. We're a state and local lobbying firm, government affairs firm here in Delaware. And, we do all levels of government affairs in the state. We focus only in Delaware, knowing that that's where our contacts and our expertise lie. And together between my dad, Robert Bird, and Kim Gomes and myself, we have combined about 70 years of experience doing lobbying. So I am also an attorney. I don't practice law in a traditional manner, but I do use my law degree on a daily basis with my work and practice in government affairs. So with that, I will introduce Ashlee. She is the senior political strategist at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She's head of the Political Affairs and Issue Advocacy Division. She leads the Chamber's political programming, which includes voter education and advocacy, candidate endorsements, and the U.S. Chamber PAC. She also develops and executes their external issue advocacy campaigns. She's a nationally respected and highly experienced political strategist and pollster with over 15 years of experience working on high-level candidate campaigns, independent expenditures, and other issues on behalf of public affairs and corporate interests across the U.S. She's worked on several U.S. presidential campaigns, including Mayor Rudy Giuliani's 2008 campaign, and as an advisor for then Governor Scott Walker's 2016 effort. She was president of Just Win Strategies, a national political strategy firm, and principal and chief strategy officer at the polling and analytics company WPA Intelligence. And she started her career in the strategy department at the Republican National Committee. She's been named a rising star by Campaign Elections magazine, and she's been inducted into the inaugural American Association of Political Consultants 40 Under 40 class of 2015. She's a regularly requested panelist and commentator, and specifically on discussing evolving trends in political tactics of public opinion research, data, digital message development, and marketing. And she serves on the boards of the Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions and the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management, my undergraduate alma mater. And she's a graduate of Allegheny College and a native of Pittsburgh. And she lives in Alexandria, Virginia with her family. So Ashlee, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that kind introduction, and congratulations on all that you and your family and your firm have accomplished in Delaware, the business community, and I'm sure all of your clients are very lucky to have you. And especially thank you to Mike for this kind invitation It was such a treat to visit with the Delaware State Chamber 2 years ago, I think right about this time, as we headed into the 2020 election. It feels like it was just yesterday, and much has happened since then, which I'm going to give you an overview of where we were and where we're headed this election season, and how we at the U.S. Chamber, on behalf of the business community, are continuing to engage thoughtfully and aggressively in politics through what has been, I think, a very interesting cycle and a very interesting at least 2 decades, as we've had so much disruption in politics, both at the federal level and of course in the states and across the country. So with that, if we could move to the first slide, please, of my presentation deck. I'm going to give about 30 minutes or so of remarks, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. But I wanted to really set the stage using some numbers and math to help guide us and think through where is it that we're likely to end up on the other side of this election season. So if we go to this first slide, past the introductory, this gives you a sense of how we viewed politics at the Chamber, starting at the beginning of 2021, as we headed toward the midterm cycle. We're big believers in strategic objectives. What is it that our members, millions of members, the U.S. Chamber is fortunate to represent, from small to big business across the country, needs out of our political and advocacy program? And how do we achieve those goals? Well, I like to use sports analogies, and I say that we are on offense, defense, and we're mobilizing, basically moving the ball up and down the field. First is on offense. We believe that it is mission critical to continue growing the number of pro-business, chamber-friendly members of Congress in both parties. There's an incredibly high number of retirements this election season, more than 50 who've left the U.S. House and 6 retirements in the U.S. Senate. We've taken it as a personal mission to do everything we can to find and support future pro-business members to help get them to Congress. Second to that is going on defense. There are a number of elected officials across the aisle who are defending their seats, and this is simply because many of them have been bipartisan and have shown a willingness to want to work together to move the ball forward for pro-business priorities, and then as a result have had a lot of challenges through this last primary season from the far right or the far left. So we are on offense, helping to grow the number of pro-business, chamber-friendly members of Congress, really focusing on those retirements, open seats, and some challenger opportunities. And at the same time, defending those who are seeking to return to Washington, who truly need the support of the business community, which is where all of you come in, and specifically on the mobilization piece. This is the work that the U.S. Chamber and our partners like the Delaware Chamber and state and local and metro chambers across the country, where we really row together. And this is making sure our members are communicating to Congress when they agree with the policy objectives that legislators are presenting, or where they disagree. And that's equally, if not more important. So we're very thankful to all that you do as members of the Delaware Chamber and supporters of the business community when you take that action to tell your elected officials, yes, please support this, or something as simple as a thank you for what you do, to the flip side of the coin, and not being shy or bashful whenever we need to stand up and say, if this legislation were to become law, it would have a significant ramification on our ability to do business. So these are the big 3 lenses through which we view all of our strategic objectives, all of the decisions that we make on politics and advocacy at the Chamber. And I think that these are evergreen as well, something that we will continue to maintain and be a part of the Chamber's program, particularly as we're working through this political disruption. Moving on to the next slide, please. I talk about disruption. I really think that this is a protracted period in time where, since the start of the turn of the new century, and you look at this slide, it's color-coded to show you every election year when there's been a change in terms of who is the party in control, whether it's in the White House, the Senate, or the U.S. House. And I encourage you to draw your attention to look at 2000, where it's purple. This was the last time, pardon me, prior to 2020, when we had an evenly divided Senate, and we had a change in terms of party control in the White House. So you see that there are more colors from 2000, the start of the century on, What this means is that 9 of the last 11 election cycles has produced a change in terms of who's in power. We know that this is tough for job creators because you on behalf of your businesses and clients are thinking about your world in 5 and 10-year terms, not every 2 years when a new party is in control and the regulatory or legislative ping pong ball is going back and forth with what seems like a shift in power every 2 years. That's tough to keep up with. And that's why those 3 strategic objectives that we have are so important. So we can be clear-eyed as to how we do our best to make sure we have enough pro-business leaders in Washington and at the federal government level to help us through this political disruption where the balance of power just simply keeps going back and forth. We have 2022 up here with a question mark. I'll make some predictions as to what's going to happen. And we've included 2024 as well, not because we're ready to say who's going to be in charge by any stretch of the imagination after that next White House contest, and of course, a Senate election and US House election. But it's important to be mindful of the fact that 2024 is essentially here, and it will hang over everything that happens in Washington, I believe, from a legislative perspective in this next 118th Congress. Moving on to the next slide, please. This is where we start to predict what's ultimately going to happen in just 2 short weeks on November 8th and Election Day. We know it's a very closely divided House. Republicans need 6 seats to take back the majority. Today, it's 220 Democrats to 212 Republicans. There are 3 vacancies, 51 retirements, 32 of them are Democrats, 19 are Republicans. And the Senate, for the second time in 20 years, is at a 50-50 split. This was the result of the Georgia runoff elections that I recall talking to this group about 2 years ago, where we anticipated that the potential balance of power could come down to 2 runoffs in Georgia on January 5th. The Democratic Party won both of those seats, meaning it was a 50-50 Senate, with the Vice President Kamala Harris ultimately being the tiebreaker. And we could be headed back toward a 50-50 Senate. And I'll talk a little bit about that more. The more important thing about this slide is you think about the role of business in politics. It's just a slim number of elected officials from both sides of the aisle that make really decisive outcomes and decisions for the business community. This is why it's our maintained and continued belief that bipartisanship must be on the menu. We need men and women from both sides of the aisle who are willing to work together to support durable, lasting solutions as we think about that political ping pong ball where the balance of power just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. It's just a handful of members who truly have a lot of power at the end of the day and are truly also deciding what's on the agenda. So with that, to the next slide, please. I believe the best way to predict the future in politics is to study the past. Historically, when a new party takes control of the White House, the opposite party takes control of the US House 2 years later. That's the moment in time that we are in now. President Biden won the White House, as we all know, in 2020. And if we go and look back through history in recent years, 2010, just after President Obama won election, Republicans picked up 63 seats in the House. In 2018, after President Trump won election, Democrats picked up 40 seats in the House. The expectation is history will ultimately guide the results of the 2022 election, paired with some public opinion numbers that I'm going to show you. And I believe it's very likely that Republicans end up in control. Moving on to the next slide. There are 3 big things I advise everybody to pay attention to when you're thinking about public opinion polling and what really matters. We've now entered the silly season, as I call it, and I'm a pollster, so I think I'm allowed to say that. But every day we're waking up and turning on the news, and there are new public polls out telling you who's up, who's down, who's winning, and who's losing. The thing to remember is that the ballot test is just a horse race and a snapshot in time. So it's not ultimately telling us who's going to win in 2 weeks, but it's directional. So the 3 big things you should pay attention to now is the direction of the country. This is also called voter optimism. On average, we see 67% think that the country is headed on the wrong track. And when you compare this to just 2 years ago, On this day in October of 2020, 63% said the country was headed on the wrong track. If you can believe that. Keep in mind, this was in the middle of COVID, was still raging. We weren't allowed out of our houses. People were not yet campaigning traditionally as they would, in the sense of knocking on doors and in-person rallies. Being back to normal was not with us yet. And at that point, just 63% compared to 67% now were unhappy with the direction of the country. So this tells you that Americans are very unhappy and pessimistic about the way in which that we are headed. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I do believe at the end of the day, there will be a penalty to pay for this dissatisfaction at nearly 7 out of 10. And this always happens in the form of at the ballot box each November. Moving on to the next slide, please, is an overview of presidential job approval averages. I've always studied the presidency in my career, and I think it's fascinating to see how the presidential job approval figures help dictate the outcome of midterm elections. We've pulled the averages back to this exact date and time through Real Clear Politics for the last 3 presidencies prior to President Biden. You look at 2002, George W. Bush headed into his first midterm election. It was a very different day in American politics. He was net positive by 33 points. On average, his approval rating was 64%. It's important to be mindful this was a year after 9/11. So the country was in a very different place. President George W. Bush was one of the few in the modern era who actually didn't lose but gained seats for his own party in the US House in his first midterm. Fast forward to 8 years later, President Obama's first midterm election. That, to me, when I look back and think about working through those years, felt like a very divisive time, a very polarized time in American politics. Obamacare had just been passed, but at that moment, President Obama was only upside down by 2 percentage points overall. So while it felt like a polarized moment in American politics and in the nation, it was nothing compared to what we're working with now. When you look at President Trump's presidency and his job approval numbers, as a political pollster, many in our community thought that this was just an outlier in terms of a presidency overall. Trump was never net positive. From the day he was elected to office, his numbers were upside down, just on his job approval. They were never in the black, so to speak. So we thought this is just a moment in time. And after the President Trump era, whoever took over the White House, things would go back to the way that they were, whatever that was. Well, we see that that's not the case with President Biden. At this point, Trump was upside down by 8 points. Today, President Biden is upside down by 11. This shouldn't all be blamed just on the presidency. I want to be clear. It goes back to the direction of the country numbers in this moment that we're living in. Coming out of a pandemic, inflation at a 40-year high, and a whole litany of issues that fall below economic concerns that have Americans very unhappy with where we're headed. And we see these numbers manifest in President Biden's numbers today. I'm not sure there's much that this presidency could do to change this. And it's because we're living in such a red and blue America where citizens have retreated into their own respective philosophical camps, and there are very few left in the middle. So we're in a very decisive moment in time. And as you move to the next slide, this tells us, what does it mean for the presidency? Well, on average, presidents with a sub 50 approval rating lose roughly 36 seats in the midterm election cycle. We're going to share all of these slides with you. We don't need to go back to 1966, but it tells you that if you're net negative, it's likely you're going to lose seats in the US House. How many? It's impossible to predict today. Some are saying between 20 and 25 seats. I've seen predictions higher than that or lower than that. It really depends which publication you pick up and read in the morning. But it should be expected based on history alone that Republicans will take back control of the US House in 2 weeks. Moving on to the next slide, and this is what I would say is the third thing to pay attention to. I know the horse races and public opinion polls are the most interesting, but I believe it's voter optimism, presidential job approval, and lastly, the generic congressional ballot that tells you where we are truly headed. Today, and the question is just, who do you want to be in charge, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? Republicans have about a 3-point advantage on Real Clear Politics. To compare this to 2 years ago, Democrats had an 8-point advantage And 4 years ago, when Democrats picked up 40 seats, they had a 7-point advantage. We thought this quote was interesting. It came out earlier this year from Rasmussen, and it was related to the redistricting that was happening. If we were to assume redistricting would be worth an additional 10 House seats for Republicans, and that's what the average was as we headed into this cycle based on the way redistricting is done at the state legislature and parties in control, Democrats would need about a 10-point advantage on the generic to maintain control of the US House. It'll be interesting to see if any of these public opinion measures are really challenged by the ultimate outcome. And I like to point back to October of 2020 when we were all together 2 years ago. And I likely told you, look, today Democrats have an average of 8 percentage points on the generic ballot. The reality was Republicans ended up picking up seats in the House. So we will see if we are challenged again in the polling community to think differently, given this moment of protracted disruption where things are not as they have always easily and historically been in politics. Moving on to the next slide, please, to start to dig in a little bit more about some other elements and variables that will make an outcome beyond just the mathematics heading into the cycle. At the start of the year, we decided to look at what was on the docket, what were the cases that the Supreme Court had heard oral arguments on last year that we could expect a ruling on this summer that might have political ramifications. We don't live in a neat and tidy world where the Supreme Court makes a decision on a hot button issue and it doesn't immediately slide into the political environment. So we were ready for this. And as we took a look at everything we could expect to get a ruling on, the one that stood out, of course, was Dobbs versus Jackson. This decision came out on June 24th, 2022, but there was the horrendous and unfortunate leak that occurred in the spring. It was on a Sunday night. I think it shocked the world. I certainly found it very surprising, where we all learned that we were likely to get a ruling on Dobbs that was going to overturn the precedent 1973 case of Roe versus Wade. And what would this mean in the political space? Well, at the US Chamber, we don't engage in social issues. We don't take a position on social issues, but we knew that a lot of our members would have to be responding to this in the corporate space. And in my role, where I'm charged with making sense of what's going to happen in elections, how would this ultimately impact some of the outcomes? I do believe that the Dobbs ruling will have an effect as a turnout mechanism. You see a lot of Democrats running ads specific to this issue. Many are still airing in tight toss-up races across the country. So there certainly is a belief, and I would imagine the polling justifies it, that the Dobbs decision is an advantage as Democrats are working to turn people out to participate in these midterm elections. So moving on past the Supreme Court slide, just let's get straight into the House and Senate in a little bit more granularity, and then we'll take some questions. So first, starting with the US House, today on the next slide, we see that there are 60 seats that are tossed up or lean. But I want to talk a little bit about competition and through the lens of free enterprise and what's happening in the House. Well, partisanship and political gerrymandering have resulted in a declining number of traditional swing seats and electoral victories decided by 5 points or less. To take us back into history, just 4 years ago, 45 seats in 2018 were decided within a 5-point margin. We saw that number shrink from 45 down to 37 seats in 2020. And then in October of 2020, as we look at toss-up and leans, there were 60. So we're basically on the same footing as we were 2 years ago. How many truly competitive seats are there decided by the Cook Political Report? And in 2018, however, there were 68 seats. So competition in the US House is dwindling. And the number of elections decided by 5 points or more is also dwindling. So there are fewer places, I think, for campaigns and the party organizations and committees to put their money to ultimately decide the outcomes of elections. I believe when you think about this in just brass tacks, what does it mean? There will not be these large majorities anymore like we've seen historically in Congress. The days of, I think, winning 60 seats simply as a result of redistricting, and that's all dictated by the census, are behind us. We'll certainly see in 2 weeks, and I've been proven wrong many, many, many times before. I'm sure I will with this election as well. That's why I think predicting something more reasonable, like a 20 to 25 seat for majority for Republicans, makes more sense. So again, we're going to share these slides with you. It gives you a sense of all of the big races across the country. Unfortunately, Delaware doesn't have one in the House space, but there's a lot of competition in the Northeast and New England, which I think is very exciting. Moving on to the next slide is a look at the US Senate. This is, I think, one of the most fascinating US Senate maps I've ever seen in my career. There's 35 contests this year. 21 of those seats are held by Republicans, 14 are Democrats. Republicans are defending 5 open seats, and these happen to be 5 open seats where the US Chamber and the business community has a very important history of working closely with those retiring US senators who are very pro-business and have been terrific for pro-jobs and pro-growth legislation. So it's important on behalf of the business community that these are seats that are ultimately filled with members who are going to be strong for all of our respective needs. So that's Alabama, where Katie Boyd Britt, we are very excited to say, is going to be the next US Senator. She was the president and CEO of the Business Council of Alabama, which is the state chamber. She won a terrific primary earlier this year, and she is going to be just a tremendous leader in the US Senate. We're very excited about her. Missouri was a race that everybody was focused on the primary and what was ultimately going to happen and who is going to be the nominee. The US Chamber supports the Attorney General named Eric Schmidt, who also has a terrific pro-business record and will do an excellent job in the Senate. The big 3 to pay attention to from these open seats now are North Carolina, where we've endorsed Congressman Ted Budd, who's running against the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Sherry Beasley. Budd has a very slight advantage. Ohio, it's an open seat where Senator Rob Portman has decided to retire. Author J.D. Vance is running against a longtime Congressman Tim Ryan. It's a very close race. And in Pennsylvania, where Senator Pat Toomey, just next door to you all or touches the border in a very small place, decided to retire. The U.S. Chamber is backing Dr. Oz. We were proud to endorse him this fall. There's a big debate tonight there, the one and only debate where he'll be on the stage with Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. So in terms of just where do these races come down and what's going to decide the outcome of the US Senate, I believe it's going to run through Georgia. These are the toss-ups where you have Senator Warnock, who won one of those runoffs I spoke about earlier on January 5th, 2021. He has to win a full term. That was a special seat. He's running against football star Herschel Walker. Nevada, there's an incumbent, Catherine Cortez Masto, who's fending off the former Attorney General, Adam Laxalt. Pennsylvania, I've spoken about Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. And then in Wisconsin, where Senator Ron Johnson, running for his 3rd term, seems to be headed in the right direction. And then the lean races to pay attention to are in Arizona, Colorado, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Ohio. I believe the real action is going to be, if you're excited to pay attention on election night like I am, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and then Georgia. And a quick note on Georgia, if no candidate reaches 50%, this goes to a runoff on December 5th. Thankfully, just 1 month after the election this year instead of 2 months after the election following 2020. So as we move to the next slide, I thought it would just be handy in our package that we're able to share with all of you, just what are the averages now in the polls. I never like to look at just one poll that comes out and say, this is what's going to happen. We always pull the Real Clear Politics averages, and you can see through these toss-up races how truly close it is and how every vote will matter. Today, on average, Raphael Warnock is up by 1 point. That means it's statistically tied within the margin of error in Georgia. Nevada, Adam Laxalt, on average, is up by less than 1 point. He's had a lead on the average polling through Real Clear Politics going back into September and even a little bit prior to that. In Pennsylvania, Fetterman has a 1.3 average advantage. That too is within the margin of error. The story there is his lead has come down significantly in just a month, where he had a 4-point advantage outside of the margin. And then lastly, Johnson is up on average by 3 points in Wisconsin. So those are the toss-ups to pay attention to, but you never discount the lean races. And what I think is so exciting in politics is we always miss something. What are going to be the big surprises on election night? I'm sure we're in for one or two, whether it's in a House race or a Senate race, but there's always something that surprises us. So we'll see what that ultimately is. And then I think just looking at time, we can go to the next slide. I just want to draw quickly your attention to the money in politics, because people are shocked anytime I share these numbers. And I just want you to draw your attention to the column where it says receipts. Raphael Warnock in Georgia has raised over $100 million. He's at 111 million. Mark Kelly's done 75 million. He's the Democratic senator out in Arizona. Val Demings, who's challenging Marco Rubio down in Florida, 65 million. Tim Scott, 50 million. The moral of the story is money in politics is changing. It's changing rapidly. It has even since 2 years ago, and especially 4 years ago. If you can't put together serious resources, you cannot be a competitive candidate, especially in US Senate races, which have certainly become more like a presidential race than anything else. So it takes a lot to be competitive. I know that's no surprise to any of you, but it's really stunning when you look at the growth in the numbers. And as we move on to the next one, just to give you a quick sense of what this ultimately means in terms of spending, I'm not sure if any of the media markets in some of these nearby contests touch Delaware, but Pennsylvania, my goodness, what a great place if you own a radio station or a billboard. You're going to do very well there this election season. More than $500 million expected to be spent. We started to see these record-breaking numbers happen in 2020. More than $500 million was spent in the Georgia runoffs, or all in Georgia when you got through the general and then those runoffs on January 5th. So again, you really have to have the money to be competitive, but you also have to be thoughtful about it. There's a lot of waste that happens in political advertising. At the US Chamber, when we do our issue advocacy spending, we use predictive analytics and data to tell us who are the audiences we should be communicating with and how. I'm a big believer in avoiding waste as much as possible. And the rise of streaming services and new social media networks have made it extremely difficult to figure out where is it that those constituencies get their news that you want to communicate with. And then lastly, let's go to, I want to talk briefly about early voting, then we'll do one more slide from here. So we have a tool that might be helpful to all of you on the US Chamber voteforjobs.com website. We have gone through all 50 states, and we started this during COVID. We wanted to figure out what were the laws that were changing across the country almost day to day as a result of the pandemic. How did it affect the ability of Americans to participate in elections? So we have built a tool that you can go and pull down Delaware on voteforjobs.com. I took a look at it this morning. Your registration deadline is in the rearview mirror. It was on October 15th. You do need an excuse to vote absentee, but my call to action is to tell everybody you can vote early in person starting 10 days out. So it looks like it's going to be October 29th. You do have that option. It's different through each of the counties. I noticed this morning in Delaware, but we really pay close attention for our members to make sure everybody's educated and can share with their employees, how is it that you can participate? And then lastly, I just want to go to the final slide in this deck, if we can skip ahead and have time for some questions here. Move to the next one. It's about the state legislatures. Keep going ahead, please. Yes, this is a perfect one to end on, the previous slide. Elections have consequences. That's a phrase that we love to use in Washington all the time. You hear it regularly, but it really is something that there's a lot of truth to. And while we only engage in federal politics at the US Chamber, we only participate in US Senate and House races, we don't touch presidential campaigns or get involved at that level, it's important to be mindful of what is going on at the state level. And today, of the 98 state chambers with partisan control, Republicans have 61, Democrats have 37. That's resulted in a lot of those outcomes as it relates to redistricting that I mentioned, where the state legislature decides how are the lines drawn. So it's very important to be mindful of always what's happening at the local level and what does that mean in terms of your redistricting and some of the public policy that ultimately finds its way to Washington. So through the Obama years, Democrats lost more than 1,000 seats at those state legislative levels. So there's now, just like at the federal level of politics, a tremendous amount of time and money going into trying to win partisan control at the state level, because this is very important for the business community and something that we pay great attention to working with our partners, like at the Delaware State Chamber. What is the public policy happening in state legislatures and city councils across the country? And could that be something that ultimately finds its way to Washington, or how can we help you in those efforts? So with that, I'm happy to close there and take some Q&A, Mike, if anybody has questions.
That's great. Thank you, Ashlee. Terrific presentation. Thank you. And as Ashlee mentioned a couple of times, she's going to share her slides with us, and we'll be sure to get that out to everybody that is on today. We'll have that on our website, and you can download those and take a greater look at all that. Ashlee, a couple things jump out. One question about Delaware politics, and I know Delaware, having been a chief of staff in the Congress for a former member from here, Delaware is a difficult place to poll in because the sample sizes are so small. A couple of questions, and I'll roll them kind of all into one. Have you seen any polling in Delaware? And I'm going to guess that maybe not, but if you have, what have you heard? And then also, do you think some of the issues that have emerged that are on the minds of voters probably play out here and in the larger Mid-Atlantic? What are your sense about Delaware?
So that's a really great question, Mike. And there's always a way to get to populations, no matter how small. It's just when you think about the polling, sort of the historical days of calling a lot of landlines are completely behind us. So whether it's Delaware to a small state Senate district to a huge gubernatorial race, even in California, you have to be calling a lot of cell phones. That's mission critical. And what a lot of pollsters are doing now, it's called mixed mode methodology, where you're getting text messages. I'm sure some of you are receiving those, being asked to take a poll, calls to the cell phone, online surveys. There's this pesky little thing called statistics that allows pollsters to collect data through different avenues, patch it all together like a quilt, but still offer some insights as to what you can ultimately expect, or at least be directionally sophisticated. Some of the public polls do miss the mark. I haven't seen public polling in Delaware lately, but there's no reason to believe, even though it's a small population, you can't go get terrific message development done and really even understand to the local level what you can expect. I think that the issues that your electorate cares about are the same issues that the electorate cares about across the country. We're seeing that regardless of partisanship, it's the inflation and economy that's driving voters this election season, especially independents, where numbers on the inflation and economy are nearly at parity with kitchen table economic concerns as Republicans view them. Democrats are a little bit more split today through healthcare, climate, of course, reproductive rights. Republicans are really focused on two things: the economy through a host of different lenses, whether it's inflation, gas prices rolling up into that, taxes, job opportunity, but then crime. And that means the border, and it means national security and what's just happening in our cities across the country. So you're seeing Republicans run ads on inflation and crime. Democrats are really focused on reproductive rights. And of course, something like January 6th is an issue that voters do care about, and outcomes of the election. So I say all that to advise everybody to have patience on election night, because I don't think that we're going to know the results in some of these places for quite some time.
Thank you. Let's talk about some of those issues for a minute. In past elections, and I remember the conversation that we had 2 years ago, we probably could have had it a couple cycles in advance of that too. A key voter block are women, suburban women in particular. How do you see, or has the data showed any movement, whether it was the reproductive rights Supreme Court decision, I think it was Dobbs, that decision, safety issues, family safety, public safety, those kinds of, we've seen a lot. I mean, just north of here in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Police Department has seen an incredible number of retirements and police officers leave, and the force is down several hundred employees. And that's happening across the country, but that's on the news here, especially in the northern half of the state, but it's happening across the country. So talk to me about women voters, maybe suburban districts, and kind of these two issues that are, they're challenging for everybody, or they're thought-provoking for everyone, but they're felt more maybe with women for sure than men. What are your thoughts?
I believe that safety is important, Mike, as you raised, and within that bucket, I would say schools. Safety in schools is top of mind, I think, for all parents, and school choice. I don't want to conflate the two or get them mixed up, but we know parents, especially in the suburbs, are really focused on schools right now, whether it's access to a good education, things as a result of the pandemic, and the continual school shootings that we see happening across the country. Just another unfortunate one yesterday. So safety is definitely top of mind for women. And then we're seeing the crime that's just exploding across the country. And the US Chamber has spent a great deal of time talking about retail theft. If you can believe it, that's one of our top advocacy priorities right now, is a call to action to put an end to this retail theft that's taking place, not just in large metropolitans, but in small towns across the country as well. So I think it's definitely safety and crime. Dobbs, that decision is going to be with us to stay. This isn't something that's going to magically solve itself. This was a decision from the Supreme Court that reverses Roe versus Wade. And we know it's a motivator for suburban women. And I think women across the country don't necessarily have to live in the suburbs. The question is, will the Democratic Party be able to turn that into votes and use it as a turnout mechanism ultimately?
Appreciate that. I have to ask you on a personal note, we hear a little bit of some friendly barking in the background. Who is that and what breed?
I'm sorry, Mike, his name is Chip. He was just let out. He's a Cocker Spaniel. And for some reason, we've been at this working from home for years, but he doesn't get the memo that when mom's on a Zoom call. So
That's all right.
Sorry for the disruption. I thought I had flagged him.
No, it actually makes it all the more feel like very real. So that's great. And we've all had that experience too, kids walking on camera, etc. So just I'm a big dog lover. So I heard him chattering in the background. So I had to ask. Question, one of our members, Kevin, asks, and I'll summarize on the Republican side in particular, but he's talked about candidates and quality of candidates. And, you've got folks that are loyal to the former president, President Trump, and you got others. Talk about the candidates and how candidates, the quality of candidates really matter on who's electable. Do you have any thoughts and comments about all of that?
That's a terrific question. And when you think about the US Senate, we have a lot of folks who might potentially find their way here to Washington who've never held elected office before. So to suddenly be running a multi-million dollar campaign and being ready for prime time is a steep hill to find your way up to. So we have a lot of folks, and I think it's as a result of President Trump, who aren't your typical candidate who serve in the local legislature and federal office for a long time before making the jump to a bigger office. I think that having a message you can articulate and figuring out what it is you believe in and how you can serve your constituents at the end of the day makes a great candidate. I don't think that you necessarily need to have had the experience of holding public office before. In fact, this is my call to action for business owners to get more engaged in the process, something we really need to work on as candidate recruitment. I believe that it's real world experience and figuring out very clearly what is it that you want to do for your constituents and articulating that message, making it simple every day, ultimately makes a great candidate. So the quality of candidates is a really interesting question. I appreciate it. What's fascinating is how the former president has engaged in primaries and the growing progressive wing of the Democratic Party has engaged in primaries, and some of those general election candidates that the mainstream media may argue are not viable to win in November because of some of those positions that they've held through the primaries, which certainly is a challenge. And you have to be able to pivot from primary to general election mode. And that's also a tough hill to climb, I think, without really having experience in that space.
Agreed. And thanks for that. Another question came in from my friend Rick Detweiler, who asks, in previous years, it was safe to say there'd be kind of a pendulum swing that kind of self-corrected extreme partisan politics, Republicans or Democrats, and local, state, national levels, all levels. We've seen some of this. Right now, there's a liberal progressive election momentum in the US, the mid-Atlantic, Northeast regions. Is it possible we'll see a return kind of to the center? And will that pendulum swing in the US? Do we see that on the horizon, either in this election cycle or interesting? You mentioned earlier maybe that, people maybe are leaving the center and they're kind of, maybe more of the electorate is moving to the left or moving to the right, and maybe the center is shrinking. Or did I mishear you? So maybe you could touch on a couple of those subjects.
Sure. So we are headed toward another change election where a different party is going to be in control of the US House. So 9 of the last 11, there's been a change. It now will be 10 of the last 12. And who knows what 2024 is going to bring. And it's impossible to predict when we will have any sort of steady consistency. I think that supermajorities are fleeting, where a party will remain in control for a long time. And that's because of the pessimism that you're seeing in the public opinion numbers. Voters and Americans are really unhappy with the direction of the country. It's going to take a Herculean effort to turn those numbers around in 2 years. I think that's why it's really important that the next Congress gets to work and doesn't let politics get in the way and disrupt what they need to get done. That's definitely wishful thinking, Mike. But as you think about the center and moderates, just in terms of voters in general, it's about 6 to 8% who ultimately decide the outcomes of elections. We're really living in a red and blue America where most individuals can tell you which party they identify with. But I don't want that to be misconstrued with the fact that there are significant shifts where you see pockets of different demographics sort of switching from one side of the aisle to the other. And I do believe that the Trump presidency sped this up. We saw a lot of college educated suburbanites, especially in 2018, the previous midterm cycle, vote for the Democratic Party where they historically may have been more likely to vote Republican. And we're seeing more of the working class, blue collar, less likely to have a college degree, now supporting the Republican Party. And a handful of Hispanic pockets of voters across the country are moving more towards supporting those Republican policies. So there's been a subtle shift of demographics moving in one direction or the other, but very few traditional swing voters left, which is why so many elections have been very close. And I give you my continued counsel to have patience on the evening of November 8th, because I think a lot of these, especially Senate races, will come down just to a handful of votes either way.
That's interesting. I saw a slide recently that showed the diversification of the electorate, which it reflects in part the population in general. Delaware is now creeped up over 1 million. We're not going to get a second House seat for a while as those numbers tick up in the House of Representatives. But I saw a number that said the greatest growth was amongst, and you just touched on it a little bit, Hispanics across the country. Can you talk a little bit more about that, kind of what the impacts on that may be?
Sure. So what we're seeing, Mike, is a real trend for different groups of the Hispanic voting population. And the place to watch right now is Texas. This is a perfect example of voters closer down to the border, the Rio Grande Valley, who are likely to support Republican candidates. This is a significant shift of the trajectory that many believed Hispanic voters were on for quite some time. Exit polls always prove this. Public opinion polling proved that the Hispanics were more likely to support the Democratic Party. We are seeing this shift, and that's very important when you think about the long-term effects of elections. And will Hispanics in general across the country start to be more supportive of Republicans? Right now, it's really localized. We're seeing this play out in some toss-up races. There's 2 in the southern part of Texas to pay attention to. But I do believe it's instructive of some of those shifts I mentioned earlier, where we're not really at a party realignment, but it's what I call a partisan realignment, where you see these shifts, small subsets of the electorate moving one way or the other. Hispanic voter participation has also been surging in recent elections. Turnout in 2018 was a 100-year flood. It was called the highest since 1912. It's expected 2022 turnout is also going to be astronomical. And we won't know until we have some exit polls. We're reading the tea leaves now on early voting in some states through the demographic groups, who participates and at what rate. And that will be a fascinating part of the post-election analysis to try to make sense of where we're headed.
Very good. In the past, when you look back over if past is prologue to the future, and I think you might have touched on this earlier, but I really want to be specific. When you look at social issues, when they're juxtaposed in voters' minds, against kitchen table issues, the economy, as passionate and heartfelt as some people feel about those social issues, at the end, do they follow those beliefs and feelings, or are they voting their pocketbook? And what's the implications?
Jumping the gun there a little bit, Mike, they're voting their pocketbook. With inflationary pressures at more than a 40-year high, something I've never seen in my lifetime working in professional politics, we know, and the data is supporting this, that when voters make a decision to go into the ballot box, it's mainly going to be based on the fact that they're struggling at the grocery store. People can't afford to fill up their gas tanks, just these inflationary pressures. And it affects every other piece of the economy on your daily life, is why we're seeing those pessimism numbers, the direction of the country being nearly 70%. Social issues will always matter and be a very important part of elections, but we're in this critical moment where I believe that the economy and inflation supersedes everything else and will ultimately dictate a lot of decisions at the ballot box.
For another workforce issue, and something that's on the minds of every employer and probably everybody that's on this call. And we've seen, statistics, and I can't quote the exact one that and the more recent one that's come out from the U.S. Chamber. But when you look at unemployment in the country, and you look at the delta between the number of unemployed and the number of available jobs, the delta is somewhere around 5 million, if I recall, where you could take everybody that is presently unemployed, get them employed, and you'd still have 5 million available jobs in this country. And we can't have birth rates that are going to catch that up anytime soon. Immigration is really the path to solving that problem sooner as opposed to later. Is that information? And because that's a real issue for employers. They're kind of torn between investments in greater technology to automate, but they need people. So on the immigration piece, is that registering as a topic for candidates? And are there some specific races where that seems to be, maybe it's the border states, maybe not. Is there a place where that's maybe playing out more dramatically than others?
Well, I would be remiss to not start and answer this by saying every day in calls like this, multiple times a day, we hear from our members. I hear directly when I'm talking about politics, this exact challenge, Mike, that you shared, with the inability to find a workforce to fit the number of open jobs across the country. And as you also articulated, there are more jobs than there are people. We don't have a job creation problem, we have a people problem. And it's our strongly held belief that this next Congress has to get serious about addressing some of these immigration challenges. We don't need comprehensive immigration reform immediately. We know that's going to be impossible with a divided government. This goes back to my point about politics is going to be a hangover to everything that we're dealing with. But as we think about the kind of candidates we're supporting, I mentioned we're on offense. It's very important to us that future members of Congress are willing to support what job creators and the workforce needs are. More visas at every level, and not just talking about this solely through the lens of national security, which that's a great place to start, and it makes perfect sense, and we agree with that too. But there also has to be some give and take where we're doing everything we can to support the workforce that our employers need. And it doesn't matter if you're a small business or a big business, everybody's feeling the effect of this moment. And we take it very seriously, and certainly do have the strongly held belief this is something next Congress can address if they're willing to work on it.
Thank you for that, Ashlee. Well, as we wrap up here, and you've been grateful, or I'm grateful, and you've been gracious to join us once again. Really great of you to do that. And we are we'll always welcome you back, and grateful to have someone of your caliber, expertise to spend some time with our members. So thank you for that. And before I ask you to close, I just want to mention a couple things to everyone. We've got some important events coming up. First and foremost, Tuesday, November 8th is Election Day, as we've been talking about. So please remember to vote. And as Ashlee pointed out, in some situations, if you've got a reason that you cannot make it, please be mindful of your options ahead of time. On Thursday, November 10th, we have a networking breakfast at Christiana Mall. And on Wednesday, November 30th, we have a chamber leadership breakfast with Fred Sears. and that'll be at Wilmington Country Club. Tuesday, December 6th is the 12th annual Taste of Delaware. Actually, we're going to be in Washington, D.C. We do this with Senator Chris Coons, and we bring Delaware food and beverage purveyors, and we take over one of the caucus rooms in the Russell Senate office building, and we'll have several hundred people there, and you're welcome to join us and bring Neil Bradley and a couple of other friends from the chamber as well. And that's on Tuesday, December 6th. And then Monday, January 9th is our 186th annual dinner. And that'll be at the Chase Center on the riverfront. And we will welcome Dr. David Tam of BB Healthcare from Sussex County, as he is our presenting sponsor. Ashlee, really, really terrific of you to spend some time with us again, and thank you. Any closing thoughts or comments as we leave this morning?
Just to reiterate, truly having patience on election night. I don't believe that we're going to know the outcome. It's the advice we're giving everybody. So hopefully within a couple of weeks, we'll make sense of where we're all headed. But I would be remiss, Mike, not to say thank you for the partnership to the Delaware State Chamber. Your work inspires us every day at the U.S. Chamber to stand with you. So thank you for all that you're doing on behalf of Delaware job creators and the workforce. And we're just very appreciative to be able to work with you so closely.
Great. Well, Ashlee, thank you again. Thanks again to my friend Rebecca Bird of the Bird Gomes Group for joining us this morning. And I hope everybody has found this helpful. We'll have the slides up, and appreciate everybody joining us this morning, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.